Hi, everybody. My name is Alexandra Gillies, and first, I'd like to start by thanking you for enrolling in the MOOC on natural resource governance and sustainable development, and thank you for joining this hangout. I think you've had a chance to listen to the lectures by myself and Daniel Kaufman and Michael Ross on issues of transparency, anti-corruption, and some governance and political economy challenges that frequently accompany, particularly in developing countries. I'm not going to kind of recap any of that material today, since you've all kind of been caught up with the lectures and the reading. Instead, I get to answer some of the questions that you've submitted. Got a list of about 5 or 6 questions, hopefully get through all of them. Thanks for submitting them. They are interesting and not at all easy, but we'll forge ahead and try to have an interesting discussion of sorts. So here we go, let's dive in. So the first question asks about the EITI, so that's this Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And the student is asking, is there any role for downstream companies in the EITI? And by downstream companies, what this person means are the companies that end up using the natural resources in manufacturing to create kind of finished products. So this could be jewelry companies or electronic companies like Apple, who are making cell phones that use a lot of kind of raw minerals in them. So this is a really interesting question. It's a question about what we often refer to as supply chains. So at the start of the supply chain is when the raw materials, crude oil, gold, copper, are being taken out of the ground. And then obviously those raw materials are processed through a series of stages until consumers like you and me end up buying them in some type of good. Whether it's gasoline or a watch or a cell phone. And there are opportunities for things to go wrong across that supply chain. And there are needs for kind of different checks and balances along that supply chain. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative looks only at kind of one component of that chain, and that's the initial stage of extracting the raw materials from the ground. And it tries to increase transparency around payments to governments. So it's about following the money rather than kind of following the supply chain. There are other initiatives known as kind of supply chain due diligence systems that are more interested in trying to make those end user companies, the downstream companies, responsible for where those raw materials come from. The Kimberley process is one of these relatively well-known supply chain due diligence models. And it was set up because of a phenomenon known as blood diamonds, that you had the trade of diamonds, particularly in West Africa, fueling conflict. And so international activists and others came together to try to come up with some kind of due diligence system that put the responsibility on the jewelry companies, on the companies that were buying the diamonds, and then processing them and selling them. So exactly what the person who asked this question was talking about. And what it does, the Kimberley standard and other due diligence standards of this kind, is that a company has to certify where they got their diamonds from or their gold from, and certify that it did not come from a conflict region, or certify that they applied certain kinds of due diligence standards to make sure that it hadn't come from corruption or there hadn't been illicit mining involved. So there are a number of different initiatives like that, these kind of supply chain due diligence initiatives that do try to put the responsibility on those end user companies. Kimberley process has to do with diamonds. There are some new regulations coming out in the European Union that the OECD has been very involved in that have to do with gold supply chains. And again, the driver behind these initiatives has often been more about preventing conflict than issues of corruption. And again, it's more about those dynamics rather than public revenues, which is the focus of the EITI. So that's kind of the first question. Asks about local content. And the person makes the very, I think, accurate and thoughtful point that, okay, if you're in a political environment where power and wealth are concentrated in the hands of just a few individuals, and then you have a local content policy, and given the oil sector, to participate in the oil sector as a local company, you're going to have some wealth, and it's going to have to be like a relatively significant business. So in that kind of environment, when you have a small elite that controls the government and the private sector, aren't local content policies just going to end up feeding that same power dynamic? And that you'll end up with companies tied to the ruling elite, local content policies. And I think that's absolutely a common phenomenon that we have seen. Local content policies frequently are used as mechanisms for delivering patronage, whether it's in the upstream or in subcontracting or the delivery of certain services. Contracts are allocated to the local companies that often have the best political connections rather than those who are best equipped to get the job done. In some cases, contracts are awarded to local companies who don't end up doing any work at all. And that's something we've certainly seen. Just to provide a couple examples, I mean, there are instances in Angola and in Nigeria where local companies received a minority share in an upstream license. So the majority share went to an international company to explore or produce oil, and 5%, 10% of that asset went to a local company that had ties to politically exposed persons. The example in Angola received some attention from US law enforcement. The US company that was the partner is called Cobalt. And Cobalt said, look, we did due diligence on these local companies. We didn't know that they were associated with politically exposed persons. But they certainly were at the time when the deal was struck. So that's one example. I think another is in a system like Russia, where you have a very strong leader, a small political elite, and that political elite is linked very closely with a set of oligarchs who also run kind of the private sector, and particularly the extractive industries. And so what you see in Russia in many cases are major service contracts being awarded by national oil companies and national gas companies to the kind of favored companies of the day. So whichever oligarch needs to be rewarded at that particular time, in terms of what the political leadership needs, they will receive huge, highly lucrative service contracts to do business in the oil and gas sector. So in that case, spreading around that business is absolutely a technique that leaders like the ones in Russia use to maintain power. Another example is, again, in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta, which is a conflict-prone oil-producing region. Oil companies have, on occasion, given quote-unquote security contracts to individuals who used to be militants, who used to be kind of fomenting violence in the Niger Delta. And in some cases, these individuals did provide protective services for the oil workers, but it's commonly perceived that these were essentially payoffs. They were saying, look, sorry, tech issue. We're going to give you this security contract if you just agree to not disrupt our operations. So lots of potential challenges around patronage, conflicts of interest, corruption when it comes to local content policies when it's in that kind of political environment. So then what can be done about that? How can you run a clean local content system in this kind of environment? I mean, it's not going to be easy. So if those in power, those in government who are in charge of enforcing the rules are the ones benefiting from this system, you'll tend to have weak rules and weak enforcement. It's a question that there just won't be the political will to crack down on these kinds of problems. When international systems and company systems become really important. So like in the Angola example, the government gave a license to an American company and said, you can have this license, but we also want you to partner with this local company. It's incumbent on the foreign company to do proper due diligence, to say, okay, is this partner that I'm taking on an appropriate partner? Or are the links between that company and government stronger and closer than they should be? So this relies on companies being interested in doing the right thing or being interested in avoiding prosecution in their home country. If a company is thought to be using its partnerships and using its contracting essentially as a way to pay bribes, then that could attract the attention of authorities, for instance, in the UK under the UK Bribery Act, or in the US under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and those companies could face sanction. So those kinds of international enforcement mechanisms become especially important in countries where the domestic authorities are not interested in guarding against this kind of behavior. So thanks a lot for that question. It's certainly a challenging area. The next one, the third question, is, and this is a bit related, so it's good. What is the most important thing that private sector companies can do to help improve governance in resource-rich countries? So a lot of the course that you're taking is about, what should governments be doing? What kinds of policies should the governments of resource-rich countries put in place to make sure that their citizens get the maximum value of the resources in their country? But as you know, governments are not the only player in this terrain. Extractive sector companies are often hugely influential and can play either a influential positive role or a highly negative one. It's difficult to identify a single most important thing that a responsible company should be doing. But the general thought that I would offer is that companies should have very high standards, and they should apply those standards regardless of where they're working. So you shouldn't have a company behaving well in its operations in Norway and not applying those same behavioral standards to their operations in Cameroon or in Myanmar. Now, in Norway, they're probably more worried about getting caught because the Norwegian regulators and oversight actors have a lot of capacity and a lot of experience, and they're motivated to do their jobs. In Cameroon or Myanmar, you're going to have weaker oversight institutions, weaker rules on the books, weaker ability for those governments to really kind of and inflict strong penalties on companies that do the wrong thing. And so the companies are less motivated to apply those same strong standards in those different kinds of environments. So that's like the kind of overarching answer, is that companies should have strong internal standards that they apply regardless of where they're working. What those standards should be, they contain a number of different areas. Social and environmental impact standards are obviously crucial. When you are how are you using water? How are you handling cleanup issues? How are you handling, the safeguarding against oil spills? That all those kinds of operational areas where high standards are needed. Another is about consultation. What kinds of consultation are companies doing, particularly with the communities in the areas that they operate? This idea that the consultation has to happen before operations begin, and that the consultation has to then have a real impact on how the work is taken forward. Another area that we talked a lot about in the course is transparency, and that companies don't need to sit back and wait to be told what information to release. They can volunteer information, and some companies have decided to do that. They've said, look, we don't think that these disclosures are harmful. We're going to voluntarily disclose information. You saw this with, there's a commodity trading company called Trafigura that's starting to disclose some information about the deals they make with certain governments. That's in a sector, the commodity trading sector is particularly secretive, even by kind of extractive industry standards. So there's a company that's decided to kind of stick its neck out a little bit. You see other companies, on the oil side, Statoil is another example that, they didn't wait until being legally required to disclose payment information. They started to do it beforehand. So having strong transparency standards. And then I think another area worth highlighting is the standards around whom they'll partner with. And this links back to the local content question is, if you're told to give a subcontract to a company that's, owned by the president's brother, you should have internal due diligence systems that you can go to the government and say, look, we have these policies about integrity and about anti-corruption, and so sorry, we can't engage in this contract. Let's take another route. Let's talk about how to get around this problem. So those are just 4 examples of areas where companies need to have, very strong standards: the environmental and social arena, around consultation with communities, community rights, transparency, and kind of anti-corruption due diligence systems. And then again, the important point is that, those need to be on the books, and then they need to be applied in every country environment. I think what you often see from the companies that are really making an effort is that they have a longer term horizon. They're more interested in preempting problems, avoiding problems, than they are, cleaning up the problems that they've caused. And I think that's the kind of, less cynical, more positive approach that we hopefully can see from more and more companies over time. Okay, question number 4. And this is quite a general one, but let's still quite interesting. So what is the best approach to checkmate governments who dish out resources to companies for self-gain? So this is, along the themes of patronage and corruption and state capture. So when you have government officials who are supposed to be, looking out for the public interest, what happens when those actors are looking out for their own interests as well and taking decisions around allocating contracts and the enforcement of regulation that are aimed at kind of helping their friends and themselves more than looking after the public interest? So what do you do in that situation? I think, again, of course, it depends entirely on the country context. In terms of domestic actions that can be taken, if you've got a government official who is breaking the rules, what should happen is, there's scrutiny from law enforcement and the police or an anti-corruption authority or an auditor investigate, discover that this wrongdoing has happened, and initiate a criminal case or some kind of legal proceeding. In countries where those types of domestic law enforcement systems have been politically captured, and where you don't have, a strictly independent criminal justice system, that dynamic tends not to happen. I think a lot of us are aware of examples where I work a lot in Nigeria, and what you see is a lot of corruption over the years that's well known. Everyone sort of knows who's involved, and yet actually bringing cases to completion, actually getting from kind of rumor to, charges being filed and the prosecution winning the case happens so rarely. I mean, somewhere along that line, the powerful people who are in trouble find a way to manipulate the system. So it's exceptionally challenging for citizens who want to see an end to this impunity and want government officials to do their jobs, rather than looking after their own benefits. So it's not impossible, though. And I think what's been happening in Brazil over the last 2 years is a really fascinating example of how this dynamic can work. That within the national oil company in Brazil, within Petrobras, you had epic scales of corruption, particularly around subcontracting. So when the national oil company was handing out construction contracts, mostly to build infrastructure, service infrastructure, there was a lot of corruption happening in that contracting process. So the construction companies were colluding, so deciding, okay, you're going to win this time, I'll win next time. They were inflating the value of those contracts. And then from those inflated contracts, payoffs were going back to the national oil company, but also to politicians and political party leaders outside of the oil sector. So huge corruption involved people to the highest levels of power in that country. But who discovered it? Who cracked down on it? Who exposed it? It wasn't the US government. It wasn't, some foreign journalists. It was the Brazilian police, who found out what was going on, went after these people, and a number of them are in jail already or facing trial. So it can work. You can have this very, grand corruption associated with, the most politically powerful people in the world. But if you have kind of strong institutions and some separation of powers, then there is a chance that those kind of domestic checks and balances can work and can bring down corruption scams, even as large as the ones that we saw in Brazil. There are some countries where those kinds of dynamics are not happening, where the rulers have such a firm grip on control that kind of a scenario that we saw in Brazil is unlikely. And I think that's where the international community has a responsibility and a very strong role to play. That, there's, if a American company or a British company or whatever is going to work in a corrupt environment, that's not an excuse for them to be corrupt. And it's up to the home country authorities, so the government of the country where those companies are based, to make sure that the companies are following the rules and that they're not contributing to the corruption in those foreign countries. And so, law enforcement activity internationally is really important, and certain kinds of diplomacy are important as well. That, what is the reputational damage and the political damage that actors face by engaging in that kind of corruption? This should not be the kind of behavior that anyone in the international community, whether it's a foreign government or the World Bank or whatever, the UN, you can't just brush that under the table and pretend it's not happening. That calling out corrupt governments and those who do business with them it's not always about throwing people in jail. There are kind of reputational levers that can be pushed as well in those more difficult political environments where kind of domestic checks and balances are struggling to perform. So I guess the short answer to that question is it's not easy at all to checkmate governments who are, using the extractive sector for their own personal gain. So the next one is about law enforcement. And so in a resource-rich countries, how do you enforce the laws to address sustainable development problems? So let's say are the laws any good? Do the laws reflect best practice? Are they designed with the public interest in mind and long-term public interest in mind? Do they reflect the country's environment? All these things. So are the laws good is obviously a first starting point. But let's say that they are good, which this question assumes. How do we make sure that they're being implemented properly and enforced properly? So this could pertain to environmental laws and protections around, certain kinds of emissions or land use, that kind of thing. It could be laws around transparency. It could be laws around local content. So whatever kind of standards of behavior that the host country has put into place, how are those being enforced? I think the interesting part of this is, so the government should be doing its job, but who's making sure that they are? And we do a lot of work at the Natural Resource Governance Institute to try to strengthen those oversight and accountability dynamics. So there's certain actors within a political system who can play that role of kind of watchdog. So this includes journalists, activists, NGOs, civil society organizations, parliamentarians often, particularly certain committees or maybe the opposition party, oversight actors that are a bit closer to government. So the Office of the Auditor General or an anti-corruption commission. So all of these oversight actors can play the role of checking whether the rules are being enforced, whether the laws are being enforced. So what keeps them from doing that or not? I think there's a few factors that these oversight actors need to have in order to play their role well. One is they need information. They need transparency. They need to know, okay, what are the rules? It's very difficult to tell whether they're being enforced if you don't know what the rules are. And then do you have the information to assess whether they are being enforced? So for example, if an NGO wants to track whether a company is paying the taxes it should pay, what information do they need? Well, they need the contract that was signed between the government and the company that sets the tax rate or sets any exemptions to the tax rate that company is allowed to have. And they need information about the actual tax payment and how that was calculated. So taxes are usually, a share of profits. So not only do you need to know the payment, but you need to know, okay, what were the profits that company declared in that given year? What were the costs that they declared in order to come up with those profits? So an NGO would need to have a fair bit of information in order to answer that very important question about whether a company is fulfilling their fiscal obligations. So transparency is one thing that's needed. Second are capable, knowledgeable oversight actors. This is complicated stuff, and so you need civil society organizations, parliamentarians, journalists who understand the oil sector or understand the mining sector. The third is they have to have the freedom to be able to speak out. You can have all the transparency in the world and very capable activists, but if they're going to get thrown in jail or threatened or intimidated every time they raise a question to the government, they're not going to be able to effectively fulfill that oversight role. And we see in a number of resource-rich countries, the civic space in which these conversations can be had is starting to shrink, and activists are facing, sometimes very blatant kinds of repression, and other times it's much more kind of subtle. So that's another factor is that freedom of expression and that kind of civic space to engage with government. And then the last is kind of around political will again, so let's say, these activists can raise questions and the government's there and listens, and, are they motivated? Is it relevant to their political future what citizen groups are saying about them? And in political systems that are lacking in competition, where the voice and the views of the majority are not what determines who gets to stay in power, then those kinds of oversight actors will face even more challenges. So just to kind of recap on this one, I think that, one way that the rules of the game can be enforced is by effective oversight actors in the domestic context, civil society, MPs, journalists, etc. But that those actors can only effectively play that role if they have access to information, if they are capable and have knowledge of the sector, if they have the freedom and the civic space to engage with government, and if the government has some kind of motive to care about the opinion that, that they're held in. All right, so this is the last question. And the question is, okay, what's the cause of bad management of natural resource income? Is it weak laws and weak systems? Or is it the personal behavior of leaders acting in their own interest? And the answer, of course, is it depends on the country. But it's an important question to ask before, acting, before figuring out what can be done to help. You see a lot of international actors, like donor agencies and international organizations like the UN and others, engaging in capacity building, engaging in a mining sector or an oil sector on the assumption that the problem here is an absence of capacity. And so if we provide trainings and guidance materials and some expert consultants, we can fix that capacity problem and the sector will be run more effectively. But in many of the countries where that's happening, it's not actually a capacity problem, it's a political problem. And that if the political leaders wanted the national oil company to function effectively, they'd hire their own experts. They would create the capacity. They've got the money from the oil sector to do so. So the problem isn't capacity, it's that for that leader, for whatever reason, having a weak, kind of chaotic, easy to manipulate national oil company is more convenient for them. So often capacity weaknesses are a sign of another problem. That really what it means is that it's politically convenient for that national oil company or that regulator or that ministry to be weak, often so that other people can manipulate that institution. And in that kind of environment, you could provide hundreds of trainings, every year, and the performance of that institution probably would not improve very much. In some countries, there are, I think, very genuine capacity problems that are holding back progress and weakening governance practices. You often see this in new producers. So of course, if you have a developing country with relatively weak institutions that discovers oil or discovers a huge new iron ore deposit or whatever it might be, they're not going to arrive into that situation with an understanding of how to run the sector. And so that's an example where, external expertise and trainings and all that are necessary to get the government to a place where it understands the challenges well enough that they can start to make better decisions. And you see in some countries that that kind of learning takes place over time. In the gold sector in Ghana, they used to have a very complicated system for assessing royalties. And, over time, in part because the levels of transparency were increasing, what you saw was growing awareness that the system wasn't working, that maybe it was kind of cut and pasted from somewhere else, some other country. I don't know the origins of the initial system, but that the collection of those royalties was more difficult and less effective than it should have been. And so what they eventually decided to do was to get rid of that more complicated system and just put in a flat 5% rate, which was much easier to calculate and to monitor, and the royalty revenue receipts for the Ghanaian government from the gold sector increased after they made that policy change. So that's an example where capacity and learning and experience did lead to better governance over time. So it's certainly both, you do need to address capacity constraints and weak systems and weak laws, especially in new producers, especially in developing countries where the overall public sector is often has performance challenges. But you can't look at that in a kind of politically naive way, that this idea that sometimes weak capacity is very deliberate. That idea should always kind of be in the backs of our minds. So that's the final question. Thanks a lot for sending them in. It's been very thought-provoking, and I hope very much that you enjoy the rest of the course. Thanks. Have a great day. Bye-bye.